Welcome back to Animation Dissection, brought to you by Whiskey Sours, the breakfast of champions. I'm Neeksy, of course, here with Zorak.
Hey, how you doing?
Hey, we're doing pretty good. Sorry it's been a while. I've been, I dragged my feet on this episode a little bit. I'm not exactly enthused by the series, but we'll get into why and why we're talking about it a bit later. But first, let's just go through a bit of the news. I only have a couple stories here. The first one is a article that I read up on Cartoon Brew and also through something that has directly impacted a friend of mine who had this happen to him. It is about a LA-based animation studio called Cosmic Toast that shut down and basically fucked over its artists pretty badly. So there was like issues with the W-2 forms not matching, so the artists might be up on the IRS, their shit list. They weren't paid for a couple months of work, so there's a whole bunch of back pay that is owed to them. There were some warning signs that this was not going to be good. This was going to kind of happen, where people's payments were getting delayed a few days, then a week, and various things like that. You can kind of read more about it by checking it out online to see kind of more specifics about why everything went bad. But I feel it's important because for a lot of people out there who are trying to find work or getting employed by smaller studios, this kind of thing is unfortunately not uncommon. So it is really good to be on the lookout for certain signs and behaviors from the management to make sure you aren't working for quite a few months for free or having a whole bunch of liabilities spring up in your life later. So I felt that was kind of important to bring up. So in the opposite end, a studio that I previously worked for that I had no complaints with, it's called Augenblick Studios. They were the studio behind Ugly Americans, a bunch of the Wonder Chosen animated shorts. There's a great film they made called Golden Age, which was something I suggest checking out sometime. They're trying to raise money to do a feature film under their own studio called The Adventures of Drunky. It is an Indiegogo campaign to raise money for it. They're trying to hit a goal of about $1 million. They have a pretty good cast list so far. Jeffrey Tambor, Tyler the Creator, a whole bunch of people working on it in terms of voice cast. So that's going to be pretty impressive. And I think they're also selling some really cool things, one of which I think is a DVD of Golden Age, which again, is one of my favorite shorts that they have produced. It's a great parody or a satire, I would say, of the animation industry's history for about, for the last 100 years. So it has some really neat stuff going on in it. So something positive to balance out something terrible. And now something terrible again. The Angry Birds movie. It came out, and it turns out its lesson is basically the opposite of Zootopia's. It turns out that xenophobic suspicion of others is a good thing, and that you should solve your problems by flying yourself kamikaze style into the homes and towers of trespassers.
As you do.
Yeah, it's a valuable lesson for children. So, yeah, the movie came out. Reviews have kind of mostly been terrible. in that regard, at least. I'm not really that surprised. I think a lot of people were hoping that, this is going to be the next Lego movie, a property-based film that was going to turn out to be good. I don't think they had expectations that it was going to be, but I think that was the hope. So, yeah. I mean, Zootopia, on the other hand, has done very well. As of recording, it has just come out on DVD, and it also passed the $1 billion mark in terms of box office. So it has done quite well for itself. And I think it still has quite a bit more time to go on that. So congratulations to the people who worked on Zootopia. I think a very well-deserved success in that regard, and probably means we're going to be seeing a lot more of that franchise in the future. Probably some kind of television thing, as Disney TV has definitely upped its game of these adaptations and things like that. And another clunker was the Ratchet and Clank movie, which has turned out to be a absolute failure with a net loss of approximately $10 million, along with any hopes or audience goodwill for the Sly Cooper feature. So Rainmaker Studios, the guys behind this film and supposedly the upcoming Sly Cooper feature, which I don't know if that's going to happen after this, but it's a pretty bad loss. And the fact that the studio was not just the production office for it, but they were also the largest investor of the film means that this is pretty bad for them. Kind of funny and hilariously, I think the president of the company came out and blamed Disney and Zootopia's success for Ratchet and Clank's failure, as opposed to Ratchet and Clank being a warmed over video game adaptation from a franchise that really hasn't been relevant for quite a few years. So,
I mean, the losses on it are only like around like 10 million or something, right?
But Rainmaker is not like a really large studio, and if you're the studio that also was the investor in it,
sure. But I'm just saying, like 10 million, like that is the amount of money that, yeah, even with an unpopular film, it'll probably like make that up eventually internationally over the tail end, you know, until it's taken out of the theaters. Like that's not like that is the current loss, but they still have like they're probably going to end up neutral, I'm guessing, right? Like
yeah.
what was their actual like profit, like their current, you know, what are their returns now?
Well, what I'm saying is, as of the article I had read, it was a $10 million loss.
Yeah, like I said, I don't know. It, depending on where they're at with, you know, with
ancillary markets, you mean?
They're probably, yeah. Most animated films can make up that much difference in their post life at the very least, just because.
But in terms of ROI, you know, it might be considered. Yeah, I mean, the thing is like a movie doesn't just have to make a profit; it has to make a pretty sizable profit these days in order to be considered not a bomb. So like, it might make up that that $10 million hole through ancillary markets such as DVDs, or maybe tied to the game sales. I don't know what the agreement is on that licensing, or the international market, but it is probably still going to be considered a bomb in that regard. Also, it doesn't help that the critical consensus was pretty low on it. So I think a lot of people I knew were kind of hopeful for it because they remembered liking the game series, but I think this might be another case of it worked really good as a game, maybe not so well as a feature film. We shall see what happens. I mean, I don't know if they're going to continue with their plans to do the Sly Cooper feature after this, but I don't know. It might come down to the fact that they aren't going to be able to attract the investors to continue, putting the money in if the ROI is going to be so low.
Sure.
So, and then upcoming we have E3, so that will be an interesting time, I guess. Video games and animation being very closely tied together. I'm not really seeing too much that's going to be revolutionary that's being announced, but we'll see. So I guess we should just jump into the subject today. So we are talking about the Flintstones.
The Flintstones.
They're the modern Stone Age family. A contradiction in terms.
Town of Bedrock. Yeah.
Yeah. Or unless you want to go for the original theme song for the first season.
The original sucks. It's
bad.
It's
really bad.
Like, it's just... How does it go again? Like, I watch it. Oh, fuck that thing. Fuck that thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's lame.
The
second one isn't, like, a great work of art.
Well, but it's iconic. It's catchy. Yeah. So
sure.
The Flintstones premiered in 1960, ran until 1966 for 6 seasons for 166 episodes. There's a lot of sixes in there. Hanna-Barbera produced the show as a way to recapture the adult audiences that they had originally cultivated and then slowly lost, as their shows around Huckleberry Hound and Quick Draw McGraw mostly seemed to attract young people. So they decided, well, let's do a sitcom in animated format, which at the time, we're talking like nowadays, where having lived through The Simpsons and the 90s, where everybody was doing animated sitcoms because that had suddenly been discovered as a thing to do. This was the first of its kind. It basically pioneered the primetime animated sitcom format. Again, which was, imagine trying to sell that to someone. That during this time period, if you were an animation studio, you had to find the sponsors yourself. So a TV network wasn't the one you sold your show to exactly to get it produced. you had to find the advertiser first, and then, I mean, it seems a lot like it used to be what the Japanese system is now, in a lot of ways, where the studios themselves have, the production studio has some kind of connection to the advertisers.
Sure.
And then also during this time period, characters and advertising were much more closely tied. So let's say your sponsor of your program was, I guess in this case, it was Winston cigarettes at first. The characters themselves would have to also sell ads. So it was integrated advertising. It was a much more common phenomenon. So if you go online, you will find some old advertisements of Fred Flintstone and Wilma talking about the smooth flavor of Winston cigarettes. Of course, this changed later after they introduced Pebbles as the daughter in, I think, the 4th season is when they did that. The sponsorship changed to Welch's, as in the grape jelly and the juice magnate, which I think made a lot of sense in terms of the type of branding they were going for. I think a lot more of the Flintstones started becoming a bit more towards younger audiences in the later seasons. I think it's also well known for its final season. In certain circles, I'd say the Flintstones was well known for it. They introduced a character called the Great Gazoo, who's kind of become, I guess I would say, like a symbolic example of desperately adding in like high concepts to a series that has essentially run out of steam. The only other thing I can really think of that's really interesting about its background was that the series was really, really influenced by the Honeymooners, to the point where Jackie Gleason was considering suing them, but because the Flintstones had been so popular on its premiere, he realized that the backlash to being the guy that sued the Flintstones and got Fred Flintstone off the air would have been much higher than having his like intellectual property and mannerisms pretty much imitated. So I thought that was kind of funny, especially as looking back at things like the Simpsons making jokes about like, hey, animation was built off of plagiarism. It's kind of true.
The funny thing is, though, like with that, like it being popular is really weird in hindsight because it is really generically just a sitcom replicate. Like it is just like the Honeymooners, but with this really thin veneer of cavemanism on it.
Yeah,
the thinnest veneer.
That's the hard part is when I'm watching it, I tried to understand it from the background of imagine what it was like when you're watching this thing on the air as it was airing. I mean, you're looking at the diet of television available to people at the time. As a kid, my local television stations, back when they had a lot more really old sitcoms just running during the day, I would get to see things like The Honeymooners and I Love Lucy, and then they would also put the Flintstones on. So when I was first watching this as a kid, I kind of understood the context in terms of the writing style in which it came. Of course, I didn't really like the Honeymooners or the Flintstones all that much. I was a bit more of a I Love Lucy fan as a child, but it makes sense. Like it's not as much of an aberration from the norm in certain ways. I think the one smart thing about it and the one interesting thing it does have going for it is the fact that it is animated allowed them to kind of explore crazier premises and stranger journeys for the plot of a given episode to go. I mean, you couldn't have an episode where the character builds a helicopter, and then flies it through the sky. Like in a live action sitcom back then, you really just couldn't do that, both for the sense of realism and the sense of silliness that would bring to just how do you pull that off in terms of effects and televisual aspects. So that was like kind of a smart aspect to this. However, it doesn't take enough advantage of it, at least for many of the episodes I do remember watching. It didn't take that high concept and run with it in any interesting way to me.
Right. And I mean, it just seems like while, the animation enabled to do a lot more stuff that they could theoretically do, like the stuff still isn't all that interesting.
No,
it's not like it's wildly dynamic or anything. It's very dry. And like in a way, like I watched a little bit of the Flintstones as a kid, just most because, it
was on
anything it was on. And, you know, I never really had a great affection for it by any means. You watch it because it was on. And, like, looking back at it in hindsight now, it's like, wow, this really, really, really is not very funny.
It's interesting how much of an icon it has become. I mean, I almost think it's much more famous not for the original show it was, but for all the various spin-offs and other things they had done. I mean, you have, the Pebbles cereal. All these kids who are coming up with the Flintstones being an icon, they don't even know that it was probably a TV series. They just know it as the cereal mascots at this point. It has become completely divorced from what it originally was in terms of as a property. I mean, and I think the only other thing I can think of is the chewable vitamins. I didn't have them, but I know they existed. It's interesting how I think it is basically just the cereal now. I think that's what it's mostly become an icon for.
I mean, I'm sure people, like, via, like, pop culture osmosis, people know, like, it's a show. They may not have seen the show, but, like, people know random stuff like that.
Well, I'm saying, like, a 10-year-old kid, though, for example.
Sure, I think a 10-year-old child would probably know that it was a cartoon once just through pop culture osmosis. Like, you pick up, like, it's not like I ever fucking watched an episode of The Honeymooners. Like, and still I know what it is just because of pop culture osmosis. Like, the amount of people who have watched any of the old shit, like, that you necessarily predated your own age, you have some concept of what a lot of shows are just through, hey, they have pop culture impact, and then through backwards references, you get the general context of what it is. Like, oh, yeah, that was a thing.
Actually, that's true. Coming to think about it, I think a lot of its other exposure that I can really think of is parodies. I mean, you see it parodied a lot on like Robot Chicken and Family Guy and a whole bunch of other areas where people make jokes about the "it's a living" type of thing. Which oddly, I didn't really see that many of those moments in there. I was kind of expecting going back and seeing that, considering how often that has been parodied. I didn't really see a lot of the horrible animal abuse with I guess a capitalistic exchange of currency that makes that abuse okay, with a tired look at the camera going, "Oh, gee, this sure sucks, but it's a living." I mean, surprisingly, that didn't come up that much.
Yeah. I mean, that stuff does exist on some of the later seasons.
Yeah, it seems to definitely have gotten much more about that and being a little bit more silly as the seasons went on.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, and honestly, that is when it actually gets, like, funnier to a certain degree, you know?
Well, it embraces the fact that it's
the
a madcap anime.
Of it.
Yeah, and I think that's what it was. The problem with it is it didn't go in that direction early on.
So early on it is more like sitcom-y, and then later on it gets more like, oh wait, we're a cartoon, it's fine, you know.
Yeah, we can get away with a whole bunch of. We can do kind of what The Simpsons became well known for, was that the beginning of the episode versus where it ends up being such a a strange journey, a like you couldn't see that coming sort of thing. It didn't do that early on enough, so that way when it started transitioning into the silliness, it didn't feel. It felt weird as opposed to, oh no, that's just the language of the show. I think that might have been what turned off a lot of people. I mean, I think also after 166 episodes, and again, these episodes are full length, as in they're 25 minutes or so, not like 11-minute 166. I mean, that's 166 25 minute episodes. You run out of steam. I mean, look again. Well, bring it back up again. Look at The Simpsons. I mean, it's very hard to maintain a show after a certain amount of time. Then again, I mean, the argument comes down to, was there anything worth maintaining? And I would say probably not, considering how generic it was. I mean, I find Fred Flintstone himself to be a very unsympathetic character in a lot of ways.
Sure, it is.
He's a terrible person.
Yeah, I mean, so much of that is just like, yeah, again, The Honeymooners there's so much there that just. It doesn't hold up to like modern cultural standards in terms of like the actual relationship between husband and wife.
Oh, I mean, I'm not talking about just that. I mean, just like in the first episode where he very clearly takes advantage of other people. He has like violence and anger. He's a lot like an Archie Bunker, but without the satirical side of it. That makes it, the audience is like, oh, I'm supposed to be making fun of this person, as opposed to I'm supposed to sympathize with his anger, as opposed to like, no, Fred Flintstone's a dick.
I mean, Barney is kind of a piece of shit.
Kind of?
He's fucking obnoxious. Like,
He's
let's
obnoxious,
get real
but he doesn't
here.
seem evil. Red Flintstone is. Red Flintstone
Except for the
knowingly
fucking
tries to
serial
like
thievery.
scam people.
Barney's evil serial thievery. My God, someone call the fucking cops on that asshole.
Would that be considered even larceny at that point?
I don't know.
I mean, well, again, how that world functions is another matter altogether. I mean,
Sure.
The technology is the source for a lot of the jokes, and I think some of the most successful jokes are them trying to come up with how do you come up with a Stone Age cognate for modern conveniences. But the problem is a lot of it's nonsensical. So like they have the power of television, like so they have. Sure. Like photography, electricity, and the ability to transmit and receive signals, but they have to power their cars with their feet.
I mean, that kind of shit is it's a goofy conceit, you know?
Oh, it is. But over time, you just start thinking about it, right? You go like, they don't have indoor plumbing. They have to use the trunk of a mastodon who is... I mean, that has to smell horrible. I mean, you're not being covered with clean water. That is like mucus and hair and all that shit is coming out of the nose onto you. They don't have indoor plumbing or faucets that really work, but they have television. I just find that really funny. Just like what their priorities were. It's like when you're watching Futurama and they have what's its name? Gluttony bot or fat bot? Like someone clearly designed the robot just to be fat. Why? Why would you do that? What are your priorities? But Futurama is in on the joke versus the Flintstones is not. So it's kind of it's just really funny to me that way. I don't know. I mean, it's also just like kind of fun to it's almost more fun to imagine the types of horrible, like, animal cognates that I've seen mostly in parodies where like, they don't have indoor plumbing, so how do the toilets work? And some people have come up with satires that try to come up with what their solutions would be, some of which are more disgusting than others, but, But, I don't know. And the other thing, too, is that even though this came out in the 60s, it feels like the culture of the world in which they exist, it feels anachronistic in that regard too. So like,
I mean, everything like then, like it reflects on the previous decade in terms of culture to a certain degree. Like it is capturing the 50s aesthetic, like
yeah. Well, even the teenagers
so
the teenagers that they had, or when they tried to portray teenagers, they had them all talking like beatniks, which is like that definitely feels at least one decade removed. I mean, again, it's understandable, but it is definitely one of those things where it's like,
I mean, we were also in like the horrors of Vietnam at this time. Like, come on, like like a little bit. Remember the 50s? Remember we were in this shit? God damn. I mean, but seriously, to a certain degree, like that is, a degree of like, that again, that is not uncommon. Like the 90s, so much had a reflection of, 80s, aesthetics with like the sitcoms and whatnot. Like that's not uncommon, or even today, like when you have like a cartoon style sitcom, it's not uncommon to have it, reflect back towards like the 50s. For some reason, like the 50s has managed to like just through this old like stuff like the Flintstones just kind of lock itself into the generic form of like Americana.
It's definitely the characteristics of it have kind of locked onto our consciousness. So like as I think when we talked about in the Freakazoid episode where the mother character very much has the cadence and the style of like a 1950s mother despite having the show take place in the 90s. Like a lot of that iconography is very much settled in there. I mean, again, what I'm saying is it makes sense. I mean, it was just interesting to me to see like the fact that a show that was in the early to mid 60s was still doing a lot of characterizations from like a decade or even more so past. So like, you would see the same things with some of the more out of touch Flintstones episodes where the joke is, hey, I'm listening to music on my iPod. That's a joke. So like every once in a while you do see that. Yes, as you were saying with modern day stuff. It's just I just find it interesting as a phenomenon to measure the delay. It's like lightning. When you hear the sound and then you try to measure how far away it is before you when you see the light and then you measure the distance between when you see the light and you hear the sound. It's like that, but in terms of culture, if that makes any sense.
Right.
Like how long is that delay? And I think increasingly it's getting shorter now, but before it was maybe a period of a decade that it took.
I mean, but in that general, like in the 60s and the 70s, like there were just like all sitcoms to a certain degree ended up playing on that stuff to the point where it almost got super meta to a certain degree. Like, I mean, we started getting things like both the Addams Family and the Munsters both doing the, hey, we're taking like a 50s style family sitcom, early 60s and such a thing, and like applying some sort of change or alteration to it to make it fit.
I think maybe the reason that the 50s and maybe the late 40s are such a big influence on a lot of these shows is because, I mean, depending on who you ask, it might be considered like the onset of either modernity or postmodernity, which was, I think, a really big influence on how people viewed the world, how people viewed family life, how people viewed work life, and just how they structured the world around themselves. During that time period, you had just the form of consumerism, the appliances, and all sorts of other things like reaching a wider audience. I mean, like, all the way through like the 20s, there were areas of the country that just didn't really have a lot of the like refrigerators. They were considered a luxury still in some areas. But around the 1950s, it became a much more commonplace thing. Just like the way in which people live was less rural, it was more suburban, more modern in a lot of ways. And I think because that was that big explosive period where everyone started restructuring their lives, that became such an iconographic, well, I guess iconic. I'm making bad words here. It was such an iconic time period. I think that was why it has settled itself into the American consciousness. That was kind of like the golden period of that form of living your life in consumerism.
Fucking baby boomers, god damn it.
Well, that was when they were being born. That's when they were all children. So, I mean, I think nowadays, because we're in very, very much so in the postmodern era, or postmodern. I mean, whatever the fuck they're going to call it now. We're not modern. We're not postmodern anymore. We're something else. That kind of thing feels anachronistic to us in a lot of ways. It's difficult for us to relate to the gee whiz. Look at this, like Look at the fact how the vending machines work. I mean, they use that as a source of humor in a lot of the episodes that I watch, like doing a joke about, oh, the vending machine is just some guy inside. Like they went to that thing a lot, but I think that's because it was making fun of the, gee whiz, I can buy a vacuum cleaner. That's a new convenience and things like that. So like a lot of the jokes being appliance-based, I think made a lot of sense looking at kind of the spread of that.
And I presume, so part of the reason why these sort of things carried forward so much culturally is it's because, for the longest time, like, the baby boomers were the main population base for so much of the country for the longest time, in the sense that, they're such a influential market. They were the primary consumers of media. That once we started moving away from that, as the primary audience, things started moving away from just being endless just references back to the 50s and such.
Well, I would also say is that that time period was also the explosion of mass media. So suddenly in the post-war period, you have a whole bunch of people coming back from war. You have a whole bunch more consumers. You have the more widespread adoption of television in everyone's homes. And so suddenly you have all these media forms being broadcast. You have all these touchstones, this common culture of TV shows that everybody watched. Like they didn't have the satellite channels. They didn't have, like 400 hours worth of television going on at the same time within 1 hour that they could pick from. So there was a kind of a lingua franca of pop culture for them. So I think a lot of that stuck around just because everybody knew what that was. Audiences weren't nearly as fragmented as they are now in certain ways, where things were on a television network were not considered relatively obscure as they are now. Mm-hmm. Like a hit show on NBC getting 8% of the ratings is considered amazing at this point. Like back then that would be considered a failure. So it's I think because of the scarcity before and the transition afterwards, a lot of that stuff just became entrenched in our pop culture canon in a lot of ways. And I think the Flintstones ended up benefiting from that because, again, it was the first time that anybody had done this kind of animated sitcom format. I mean, I'm trying to remember, do the later episodes keep the laugh track in there? Because I remember early on it did.
I think so.
I mean, and that was kind of weird in a lot of ways.
Laugh tracks still feel weird to a certain degree, and that comedy.
It's like I'm watching an episode of Big Bang Theory for how much they inappropriately use the laugh track on this thing.
I mean, like laugh tracks, like in general, feel it's back in the day. It feels like they did not use them well and used them very poorly. Like even
some of the shows did actually use live action audiences. So like if you watched an episode of Cheers, it was structured a lot like a stage play, and the laugh tracks felt a little bit more organic versus this one. It's entirely artificial. There is no possible studio audience to have this reaction coming from. Like I've sat in studio audiences before on like a Colbert Report, and that stuff is a lot more organic. But then there's this where there is no possible audience. Like the people at home know that there was no audience watching this thing. I mean, it's the same thing with the Scooby-Doo laugh track. It's really weird, and it feels like this intrusion of another reality on top of it that is like, well, who's the audience that were watching this and they're recording? Well, clearly there wasn't, because it's cartoon.
Sure.
It's very hard on the animators' wrists to animate these shows live.
I mean, even with stuff where it's like actually funny, like the Flintstones, where it's in general not. Like, look at something like Monty Python, which is a very, very funny series. That has a laugh track, and boy, that laugh track is kind of rough these days. You listen to it, it's like, man, these laughs are so canned as hell that
because they were.
Sure,
a lot of those segments were not recorded from an audience.
But even with good, there is a way to do good canned laughter. You can make it work. It does not work, even for like something where it's actually funny. It is really it is in itself.
Jokes.
It is in itself funny when a funny joke almost gets kind of ruined by like the fake laughter. By like, oh yeah, I was gonna laugh, but then the fake laughter stopped, and it actually made me not laugh. It made me unlaugh.
You just don't like being told what to do.
Sure, that is very true. But even in the sense, like I don't know, like it's a weird balance. There are certain laugh tracks that I think can work for certain shows. It does not work.
If the laugh track is paired with a joke that actually is worthy of laughter, I think that actually works really well. But when you clearly are using the laugh track to make unfunny dialogue sound funny, again, if you ever watch Big Bang Theory, it's that. I mean, it's just like, we don't have jokes. We need to put in a canned laughter to make people think that a joke was just said. And in this case, and with many other shows, it was very clear like this. That wasn't a joke. You just stuck it in there to make an unfunny sequence sound like it was supposed to be a joke. And I definitely found it really weird. And also the fact that I'm very clearly listening to the laughter of death. A lot of laugh tracks are recorded from people decades and decades past. So if you're watching a modern sitcom that's using a laugh track, just remember that you are listening to the laughter of death.
Yeah.
Again, with a cartoon having a laugh track is even more removed. Like, again, when you're watching a sitcom, like certain classic ones that say, this was recorded in front of a live studio audience, and the way it was filmed and the way the sets were constructed, it feels, again, like if you're watching an episode of Cheers, that feels like you're watching a stage play. Just like the way it was set up and things like that, it made a lot of sense in terms of staging. Other shows that have a laugh track, when you go this is very clearly this had to come from the outside. This doesn't feel like a bunch of people were actually watching it while it's being recorded. It feels artificial. I think there is a subconscious artificiality that people are able to pick up on in this regard. Because again, there's plenty of shows that are recorded in front of real people, and their real reactions are being recorded. But in plenty of other ways, they're trying to pretend. And I think people do pick up on that. With a cartoon, you have completely removed the believability that any audience could have been laughing in the first place.
This cartoon was animated in front of a live studio audience.
But like I said, that is a bit hard on our wrists. We're not going to do that.
Should we talk a little bit about the animation, itself, the actual animation quality?
Yeah. So
it sure is one of these. It sure is one of these shows from one of that studio.
From Hanna-Barbera. I mean, okay, to give it credit where credit is due, it has some interesting stylistic elements to it. Like I think the designs of the main characters are pretty cool. I think once you start getting into the tertiary characters, they clearly, did it on their lunch break. They don't look very interesting or good for the most part.
Sure.
But the main cast is very, iconic. The chunky line art was a really interesting thing. The kind of, we're not going for believable forms, for kind of embracing the ultra flat nature of the character designs was, I think, very much of the era. I mean, it's that cartoon modern type of look. The backgrounds I thought had a really great texture to them. They're kind of inventive and really interesting, like the way they designed the exterior of the home and things like that. That stuff is really cool. It's also television animation, so of course it's going to be somewhat limited, but boy, do they have to recycle a lot. And also, I think a lot of the animation just doesn't really enhance much.
Sure.
I mean, it feels piecemeal. It feels like it's just a vector for the dialogue. I mean, that's a critique I have for a lot of the animated sitcoms where they're not using it to do anything interesting visually. It's just the characters are standing around and they have to either move or bob their head or tilt their head slightly at given points during the dialogue delivery to make it not look like just a mouth flap. Now, you see that with Family Guy, for example. Like the character, if they're giving a certain long line, you'll just see them tilt their head at a random moment we have to put in some movement here. It was kind of like the start of that type of phenomenon, I think.
One thing I find interesting, both from of course, it's a big part of the Hanna-Barbera cartoons. It's one of the cost-saving measures. But even though it is animated, they still are completely married to the sitcom thing of it. Oh, everything moves in a 2D frame, plane. Everything moves side to side. Like that is so core to what a sitcom is. Except for, I don't know, I don't know if there's any exceptions to this. Maybe the Munsters, I don't know. But, so much everything is stuck to okay, we have these sets. It's a cutaway through the set. We're never going to show the 3D plane or have things really interact in a 3D plane of this because fuck that.
There's no over-the-shoulder shots. There's no reverse shots. It's
there's no Fred Flintstone moving towards the camera because he moves left to right, and this house will loop as far as it needs to be to make it work. Okay, yes, that's a gag. They've done that many times as a gag. That's endlessly been a gag of things that they make fun of. Fucking Hanna-Barbera itself makes fun of that as a animation trick that they use for the longest time. But at the same time, it is kind of funny that they just are so married to that 2D plane to make it work.
Well, again, it only became a joke once it was established as a thing. This was where they establish it as a thing to be able to be commented on.
It's been a thing for. I think that's been a thing in Hanna-Barbera from before this to a certain degree. But it became much more apparent, I think, during this time. I mean, this was when it was still being used unironically. At least, I don't remember it ever making jokes about its own looping backgrounds. But as you say, the show does have what I call, it has no sense of Z space, X, Y, and Z coordinates. Sure. And I think what you're getting at is the difference that people say in terms of sitcom. You have a 3-camera sitcom and then a single camera sitcom. And it's a little bit counterintuitive. A 3-camera sitcom is considered the classic sitcom thing. So you will have a stage clearly cut in half. Everything is arranged much like a stage play. You don't even have a proscenium. It's just a scene. It's a very flat type of stage. And the 3 cameras are basically, you have the big shot and then 2 close-up shots. So you have a camera in the middle, usually a camera on the side, on either side of it, and that's it. Those are the angles you have, and those are the angles you're going to be cutting between when you're doing your editing. A single camera sitcom, oddly, is the one where it will take place in a real world setting or a constructed set where it feels like they have actually constructed, a space in which these characters operate. So a 30 Rock or a Parks and Recreation are considered single camera sitcoms. Sure.
If that makes any sense. So, single camera sitcoms didn't really exist, until much more recently. So the language in which this type of thing is that, this is how sitcoms operate. You have, the flat plane, because we're not going to move the cameras around that much. That's, we can't, just because we didn't build the set to have a 360 panoramic ability. This is not a real world location that we have set up to do filming in. the same thing applies to animation. If they wanted to do shots and reverse shots, they would have to have drawn a whole bunch of new backgrounds to do so.
Right.
So, I mean, a lot of that was convenience, and that affected all the staging. That affected all the compositions. And also, that was just the language of sitcoms for a lot of people. People would not be able to really recognize it having a filmic editing style, to have a filmic dynamism to it. I don't think people would have recognized that. I mean, nowadays we take it for granted. Like even Family Guy will have reverse shots occasionally. You know,
Sure.
I mean, they don't do it enough, so it looks really flat and kind of like someone just built something in Flash and stuck the characters around it, you know, willy nilly. But you know, they have the ability to do so, and they sometimes will take the opportunity to do so. Like The Simpsons, I think, did a great job with it back when they were doing a lot of these great cinema parodies, where they would use these compositions and these angles to express certain emotions that they don't need to have the characters tell you or to explain in another format. They're able to use the language of film in a lot of ways. Television, I think it took a lot longer for the language of film to really penetrate it. Because like film and television were much more separate for the vast history of television until recently. I mean, you know, television now is extremely cinematic, I think. I mean, looking at things like Game of Thrones would look like a feature film, you know, in 90s terms. You know, we wouldn't have television that looks like that back then. So I think a part of that is a mixture of convenience in terms of just cost-saving measures, but also that's just how they understood it. I mean, that's how they understood that was the accepted language. You know, it's like when film was first coming out, editing had to be invented. The relationship between one shot and the next, and how to use that to create a sense of emotionality and a sense of continuity, that had to be invented. You know, and I think in this case, it wasn't until much later that we realized, hey, we can actually go a little bit beyond that. Although I do also think that the Flintstones visual language stuck around with us a little bit too long. You know, like when I'm looking at things like Fairly Odd Parents, where it's like it's much more modern day in terms of like when it was being produced, but everything was super flat. Everything was very, you know, 2D space, as you're saying. You know, that kind of thing drove me nuts as a kid, especially, you know, when we were doing a lot of these action shows, these Saturday morning cartoons for kids still felt like they were very entrenched in that 2D layout, even though they're supposed to be trying to deal with 3D space.
Right. Yeah.
Or I could just be going, you know, too much off on a tangent, but that's what it feels like. I mean, I think the Flintstones established a lot of that animated sitcom language, and I think,
Sure.
you know, for Hanna-Barbera, they just, you know, continued on that for a very long time. I mean,
Sure. I mean, to a certain degree, it's a cheaper way to go and do, like, both from the sense of like, okay, you don't have to worry about the actual spacing that much. You know, you can kind of just use the backgrounds as needed, or reuse the backgrounds as they often did in these shows. Certainly, you know.
Well, yeah. Why redraw the interior of the house if there's no other angle inside the house to explore?
But it also works for the characters themselves, because they don't have to think about like, okay, what would Fred's face look from this angle? Because look, you got two angles on Fred. Don't worry about it. You got it. Like, you need to redraw it, but you have all the reference material you need to draw that face perfect each goddamn time. Like, it will take you 2 seconds to draw this face because you've drawn this face a bunch. You know, it ain't that different each time you do it.
Well, also think about it. How does that character design translate to three-dimensional space? It really doesn't. That is the big thing about that cartoon modern movement during that time period. If you look at the UPA style cartoons that were, you know, the big art house, you know, I won't say art house, but they were like the big thing. You know, like even the Warner Brothers cartoons did those really weird modernist style cartoons every once in a while. That was one of those things where like, we're going to embrace the flatness. These characters could never translate to a 3D form in any way, shape. So how would you draw the head cleanly moving from left to right in a 3D? You can't.
But
that in itself was an advantage for them. People would accept the fact that you can't necessarily smoothly animate between the two, and so you just do a very quick smear or just a rough transition, and that's all you need. People just understood that because these are very flat. There was no believability of form for the audience to suddenly go, wait, that doesn't look right. Because it never had that to begin with. If you never established that, like, wait, that hand is not moving through space correctly because I am now being conditioned to accept that there is a third dimension, and then they fucked it up. Well, in order to never fuck that up, they just never established that rule. They never established that extra plane of existence to fuck up.
Yeah.
If that makes any sense.
No.
It's all about what the audience is primed to expect and then meeting those expectations. And I think that's why the Flintstones was so successful at its time period. I mean, if I think the Flintstones had premiered later or was a show that had come on the heels of another show like it probably wouldn't be as successful. But because of its sheer novelty, I think that's what made it become an iconic thing. Even though the quality of the writing itself was pretty bog standard for its time, it was like, well, animated sitcom with a high concept, like we had not seen that before. Therefore, it made a big splash and inspired a lot of other things. So, again, I was not really that enthused by the Flintstones either as a kid or now. Although I think now I found it as an adult much more tolerable to watch because I could understand it historically. Whereas as a child, I go like, this is just boring.
See,
I also hate this main character. He's a jerk.
See, I have the exact opposite reaction where like the child, it's like fucking whatever. I'm not really paying that much attention to it. It's on. Accept it. Fucking who cares? But now it's more like, boy, I got so much better shit I could be doing than actually watching this garbage, Well,
I'm not saying it was entertaining. I at least understood it. It's like going to a history museum. That's what it was like for me. Like, if you're a kid going to a history museum, you might be a little bit less, inclined to be able to do that. Instead, why aren't we at a theme park? As an adult, I can go to a historical museum and I go like, okay, I have something to contextualize this and kind of find it interesting as a historical item, not as an entertainment media in its own right.
Sure.
So, like, being an adult, I'm able to appreciate that aspect while still going, yes, it is extremely boring by modern terms. It's like me watching certain classic films, and I go like, yeah, there were films that came later that were better, but I understand it as a historical piece.
Sure.
So I was at least able to understand and appreciate it on that level while still going, I hate this so much. I just really did not like it in any way, shape, or form. At least not as it was intended to be observed by audiences. I don't think it was aware of its own history at the time.
Sure.
So, but again, like you can't say that it also wasn't a pioneering show in certain ways. I mean, yeah, writing wise, no, but I mean, just its own existence. I mean, like how if you look at some of the history behind it, like. And some of the stories about like how they had to sell this show. I mean, how they had to go to like all these different advertisers and just keep pitching it over. I mean, the original pilot, I think, was made in the early 50s. I mean, like I think back when it was called like the Flagstones. The original pilot was quite a few years before it ever got made into television, just because none of the advertisers or the networks knew what to do with it. No one had done an animated sitcom before. Now we're practically sick of them.
Yeah, definitely.
I mean, of course, there's great ones going on now, like Bob's Burgers. I mean, well, that's the interesting thing is, well, look at the differences, how far we have come in terms of that. When you look at like a show like Bob's Burgers, as we've been talking about in terms of the composition and framings and the camera angles and things like that, that is a far more advanced jump. There are reverse shots. There are like over the shoulder ones. There are dramatic camera angles and really inventive things. It shows that we have come along. Well, in certain shows, yes, we have come a long way. In various other ones, maybe not so much. But it is interesting, at least in that regard, as just like historical context. And that's the only way I could really recommend viewing it is if you're just interested to see what we're talking about, to see how far we've come, to learn about what the origin is, that's about it. Otherwise, it's going to be extremely archaic in comedic sensibilities. I think in social sensibilities, it is definitely very archaic. I remember as I was watching this, I was talking about how I was often kind of horrified. I mean, not surprised, but horrified by the gender dynamics of certain episodes. Where I think
were you really that surprised? I mean,
I wasn't. No, I said I wasn't surprised. I was still horrified. But it was, I think one of Betty's lines where she's like, I want to, I only make it as far as the supermarket. I don't know if there's other homes or houses out there, or it's like, oh my God, that is like something that one of those people that's trapped in the house by a crazy person for 15 years and has a kid in there that also never gets to go outside for 15 years. That's the type of shit that they say. So like, again, by modern sense, I mean, I get that it's supposed to be a joke, but it's that's a horrifying concept for a modern day audience. Again, I'm not surprised by it because that was just, a cultural thing, but I can still be horrified by it.
Sure.
Just because I expect something doesn't make it any less bad. So, I mean, that's kind of an interesting thing too, is just to see the kind of the values of the time period being expressed. I mean, again, Fred Flintstone as this character, the really archaic thing for me was whatever that weird cult or boys club that he belongs to, the Buffalo thing.
Yeah,
the lodge type of thing.
That does really not hold up culturally at all these days. I mean, that stuff still exists to a certain degree, sure, but it's not nearly
kind of like a country club. But that's not really,
no, those fucking things still exist. Like Moose Club still exists, man.
Oh yeah, but they're not as much of a like, having him being.
No.
Yeah, I mean, he's also this blue collar worker. Like he is extremely, removed from the lifestyle of a modern blue collar worker. I mean, so I found that as a very interesting phenomenon. I mean, again, he's the 1960s was an inheritor of or at least the foundation of what we called the Great Society in American culture. So his lifestyle is a lot more removed for what we would recognize now from a guy that would work essentially a factory job. So that is an interesting aspect as well. Right. Those types of clubs would never allow a person in his cultural status to be a member, in the more modern day sense. So that definitely doesn't hold up. I mean, the record players hold up because, well, hipsters. Also, I have a vinyl collection, but certain things are kind of universal. So there's some interesting things there. Just looking at the historical oddities. Again, I view it as a really interesting reflection of the concept of modernism and the oncoming approach of postmodernism. But if that would mostly appeal to people who are interested in cultural studies, sociology, and a bit of media theory. But other than that, the show itself is less entertaining than it is as a status as, the show that it was in the pioneering aspect it was. So without it, we wouldn't have The Simpsons.
Sure. Probably not.
I'm trying to think. Like in my head, I'm now trying to think of like all the other times that Hanna-Barbera tried really hard to repeat the formula. They had another one where it was basically the same thing, but it took place in like the Holy Roman Empire. I can't remember the name of that show, but they did that. They did. I think that was also Wait Till Your Father Gets Home. They tried to repeat their success a lot with very diminishing returns.
Sure. And they've, tried rebooting the Flintstones several times. They did that movie in the 90s. I think they're doing another movie again.
Well, I think Seth MacFarlane has the rights to be able to do a reboot of it as a TV series. Woof. I don't know if he's ever done anything with it. I just remember reading at one point that he had the rights to it. Seth MacFarlane has gone around and acquired the rights to a lot of different things. I mean, he's also the one that got the rights to Cosmos and was the guy behind doing that new version of it. So he does a lot of that type of stuff. So who knows if he got the rights to be able to reboot it or, whatever. I don't see the point in doing so. I don't know what the Flintstones would really have in terms of commentary on modern day life or the high concept being all that interesting. Other than going like, oh, my iPod is made out of rocks. Brr. Like, I don't know what else it could really do.
Yeah, I don't know what in 2016 or whatever Flintstones could be. I guess you could try like Futurama-ing it, just like reverse Futurama.
Well, like having it being a parody of 1950s sensibility, maybe?
Or maybe just go full on like, just modernize it, have it more modern and reflect back kind of like how Futurama was always like, okay, it's the far, far future, but it's actually reflecting on the current era.
Or like the universality of human experiences, like no matter what time period you're in,
sure,
these are the types of experiences.
You just do that with like fucking dinosaurs or whatever.
Yeah.
So,
So do you think that since they existed before the time of Christ, that Fred Flintstone and all his family and friends are burning in hell right now?
Absolutely.
I'm not quite sure how it works, but I think that's how Catholicism works.
No, yeah, absolutely.
You'll never be saved.
Of course.
Were there any gags that you ended up liking?
No. I mean, honestly, if I'm going to be completely honest, some of the "it's a living" gags are actually kind of funny. The issue is that they realize that and they repeat them like 5 dozen times. Yeah,
I mean, as a concept, it's really funny because you can go to some really dark territory with it. But I find people parodying that end up making more effective use of it than the original thing did.
Sure, and otherwise, the great Gazoo is not actually that bad.
No, but I think he is a good shorthand for jumping the shark. I mean, this is before jumping the shark existed as a concept, but I think a lot of people look back at it and they go, you could just feel the desperate, like you just knew they were running out of ideas. And of all things to stick in there, it was so weird. It just didn't, again, if you're watching the first season and then you're watching The Great Gazoo, I mean, it's just such, like, what? Where did they come up with that? It just didn't work. I mean, and then they had, you saw the same thing with the Jetsons, frankly. I mean, they added whatever that thing's name was. It was this supposedly supposed to be cute series of like fuzzy things attached to a spring that look like this or something like that. And whenever you see them adding those to the shows back then, you just knew it was on the downswing.
Right.
That was always their desperation move. And this one, you could smell it. You could just feel it in the core of your being. Like they don't know what they're doing. Yeah, I think that's it. I mean, I can't really think of anything else. The characters aren't really. There's no arcs. There's nothing to really speak of. So in terms of recommendation, yeah, I mean, unless you're interested in just the history of things, maybe watch an episode of it. Maybe also watch some sitcoms from that same time period just to kind of understand it in context. But I wouldn't go to it to try to watch anything entertaining. I find it funny that YouTube has the entire series behind a paywall. I don't know who would want to buy that series. I can't think of anyone that would be such a big fan of it.
Sure.
Unless you're a historian on some level. So I'm pretty sure you don't recommend watching it.
Nope. Definitely not.
No. So I think we should talk about what we're going to be doing next week or next time. I don't. Would you call it a challenge episode or a special episode? We're going to be talking about something that is not in our usual wheelhouse for discussion. It is a Warner Brothers short, but has definitely become very popular lately, and I think for good reason and for good merit. The Dover Boys.
Yeah, so I think we're going to talk about it. One, because yes, it's for some reason has resurgence of attention. Two, because we both, spoilers, both love the Dover Boys. Like even what you
would have to be insane not to love it. I mean, yeah. I mean, well, animation schools show it quite a bit. Like when they're teaching you about smears, That's the thing they show you, like, as like, this is how you can use them.
Yeah, it is a touchstone. And we also thought it'd be kind of fun just to try something a bit different and just look at a singular episode and a singular thing and just kind of talk about it in a bit more detail as a microcosm rather than a macrocosm, as we often do with these works. We talk about some pretty broad strokes, And while I don't know if we're necessarily going to go, it would just be, if we're going to just go like, here's the plot of the Dover Boys, because it really doesn't matter. I think it's more just that we want to touch on things that we like about it, things that are really interesting about it, maybe talk about the history of it and why it's so,
why it's so popular. Well, it's like, just like anything, like I can find a subject within it that can lead to a whole bunch of different places. So
Sure.
I think for me, that's going to be my challenge, is to see to find all the different elements that are going on inside of it.
Yep.
So that's something I'm very interested in doing. And also, it's fun to talk about something I actually like.
Yep.
As much fun as it is to sometimes crap on something, other times it is a slog. I am trying to find things to talk about sometimes, to give meaning to my experiences and to give meaning to the time I spent watching this fucking thing. But in this case, it's well earned. So definitely go check out the Dover Boys. Watch it multiple times. I mean, every time you're gonna find something else that's going on in it. Yeah. So look forward to that. We will talk to you guys next time about that. Until then, you can always contact us on Twitter or through email. The email is adthepodcast@gmail.com. You can hit both of us at Twitter, but more importantly, you can also subscribe to this on iTunes, rate and review it, which helps raise the profile of the show, brings it to more people. Something about the algorithm that they use to do listings, so that way if you're trying to find episodes of this, it's easier to find if you have people who rate and review shows. It's weird. It's like how YouTube does things too.
Yep.
It's the way podcasts work. So if you could do that, that'd be really great. Again, send us suggestions. I have a running list of things. The Flintstones was suggested to us by a friend of ours, so we do take suggestions. So definitely do that. So yeah, reach out to us. My Twitter, of course, is @RYFMagnuson.
And I'm at SA Zorak.
Got anything else to plug on your end? Any projects you're working on?
Nope, nothing to plug at the moment.
Gotcha. So we will see you guys next time.